There we are. All right, everyone. Good to see you. Good to connect. Just double checking to see if you've got visual and audio on everything here tonight. Um, it was a little bit hectic, kind of at the start of things as we were. See if I can fix my background a little bit too. It's sort of kind of a mess back there. There we go. We had some technical difficulty trying to get our internet just in our home working correctly. So rushing around at the last minute trying to get that set up, and in the midst of that, I think a few other things decided they weren't going to work. So, this whole technology thing is such a challenge, and just good to be together. I'm going to keep making just a few little adjustments as I'm talking, and we're getting started here, just to kind of get myself back where we need to be. Multitasking for sure. So hang in there. As we're kind of going over a few technical things, let me just take an opportunity as I'm saying welcome to everybody, and I'm so appreciative that you're checking in and using the chat feature to say hello to one another. Let me just say a couple words about the YouTube experience. And, we have various degrees of, I suppose, levels of comfort around YouTube and just computer in general. If you haven't discovered, when you're viewing something like our webcast here tonight, you have some options, two main options when it comes to how you view it. If you're on a cell phone, obviously, you're limited. You've got the up and down version, which is just a little tiny picture at the top with the scrolling chat. Or if you go landscape, you've got a little wider picture, but lose some of the capacity to see the chat window. When you're on a laptop or a computer, in the right-hand corner of your YouTube screen, where the picture is, you have the option of going either kind of quarter screen, or if you click that, you can go to widescreen. When you go to widescreen, what you see is the whole thing that's here in the picture part. Me, and then this recorded scrolling kind of multicolored chat window, which is different than the actual live chat window. So if you're in full screen, that's all you can see. You can't actually participate in the chat feature. If you go back to quarter screen, then you have access to the chat feature, the live feed of it, and can interact. That's what's being recorded over here. And so it's kind of a layer. It's called an overlay, what we're doing here. And that's only so that when this is recorded, or as it's recorded, those who view it will be able to see the chat discussion. So I know it's a little confusing, but that's kind of what's going on, and just kind of experiment till you get it set the way you like it. If you're participating in the live chat, you obviously aren't really caring about what's on the screen in that chat window, which is fine. But that's kind of why it's two layered and happening or simultaneously is the word I'm trying to say, and why there's also a delay in what you're seeing there. So I don't know if that was helpful or not. It sounded a little bit confusing as I heard myself saying it, but I know there's been some questions about that, so wanted to take a moment to share that. I think it's time to get started. That's enough tech talk. Let's just get right into the resurrection talk, which is why we're here. Of course, one of the great things about our webcast study is that we can keep going week by week with connecting with one another, which I know we're all finding to be so valuable when we don't have this capacity to be together physically like we so are used to and long to do. And so that we have the capacity to do it this way is, there's a blessing wrapped up into that. So I'm glad for that opportunity. And what we're doing is picking up the writings of a biblical New Testament scholar and leader of the church in England, whose name is NT Wright. He's still alive. He's a contemporary. And he has written a lot of books. The book that we're focusing on is the one called Surprised by Hope. And he focuses specifically on how we think about heaven and resurrection, and ultimately then the mission of the church. So that seemed like a beautiful theme, actually, as we have followed our celebration of Easter and are now living into these days after Easter, or living into the time of resurrection. And I think that's where I wanted to begin tonight, to say that resurrection or Easter is in the life of the church thought of as a season of time. It's not just the day or the time of Easter morning, but it becomes a way of life in the world. And so it's thought of as the season of Easter. And even more than that, I think what NT Wright is wanting us to think about is the fact that it's not just a season, it actually is a way. It's the way of life, I think he would say, in the faith, that it truly is the way, the truth, and the life, and it connects to Jesus Christ. And the impact of it is something that is with us now and always. And so it's this broadening experience and this widening of our thinking about what resurrection is, what it means to us, how it connects to us, and the way in which it shapes us in this world, particularly as people of faith. That's the key, I think, to what NT Wright is giving to us by way of both his writings, but particularly in this webcast by way of the videos that we're sharing. So all of that, I think, is helpful and so relevant to the time in which we live. So I hope you're finding some enjoyment through all of that, and that it's a positive experience for you. And as I said, I think last week, it doesn't mean that we always agree with everything that either NT Wright says or what each other says. This is not about agreement. It's okay to have some tension in differences of the way we think and experience things. God's at work in that too. But I think overall what we're saying is, let's be open. Open to each other, open to God, open to what NT Wright is saying, and at least we can then learn from that. If nothing else, it might help clarify where we come down on these issues, how we understand them, even more importantly, how we experience them in our faith. So it's all good, as we say, even though at times it can be challenging, and we're not going to back away or be, afraid of that or tentative about it. We can do it, and we can do it together. So that's why we're here. Let me say a prayer, and then invite us as we move on to prepare to hear our video for this evening. So let's pray first. God, thank you for one another. Thank you for our brothers and sisters in Christ who are connecting in our study tonight. And we pray that you guide and lead us, help us, as we've just said, to be open to what it is you would help us not just know, but what it is you would help us be or become in and through Christ our Lord, who we know has been raised and is alive so that we too might live. It's in that name that we pray. Amen. So back to NT Wright just for a moment. I may have mentioned earlier that he has been a leader. He actually was a bishop, a retired bishop now from the Church of England. Along the way, he became well known as for his scholarship related to the New Testament and to the early church. In his later years, which are now, he discovered the value of digital media and ministry by way of video and webcasting and teaching like this. So that's why we have these wonderful videos. Actually, the video series and book that we're looking at here through this time, these sessions, was written almost 10 years ago now, not quite, 8 years ago maybe. And so there's a little bit of date on it, but as I say, it still speaks very very relevantly to us and to our life as Christians now. So, N.T. Wright comes out of the church. He is a part of the church. He is a leader of the church. He's not just an academic, but he's been with the people, and shared life and faith in local settings and within communities of people. So, he kind of gets it and understands how important it is for us to be both practical, but also, experience the reality of what we are talking about, that it's not just something in our heads, it's not just ethereal kinds of musings about, what does all of this mean for me, but how do we live it? How do we experience it? How do we share it together? How do we encounter it? So, that's sort of his focus. I wanted to bookend our conversation starting now, and then we'll come back at the end of our time with a statement that I've pulled out that reflects, I think, NT Wright's, some of his summary thought about what all of this is to mean. So let me read it and have us just hear it, kind of let it ring in our minds and hearts at the beginning here. And then I want to come back and lift it up again at the end. So this is the statement that I noted that I wanted to lift up. It says this: the hope of resurrection is more than anticipating we will leave this world someday and go to heaven. Rather, it is a bold confidence that God's kingdom presence and power are breaking into our world today, and a whole new creation has begun. All right, that's kind of long. I'm going to read it one more time just so we can hear it and kind of let it sink a little bit beneath the surface here. Let me share it again. The hope of the resurrection is more than anticipating we will leave this world someday and go to heaven. Rather, it is a bold confidence that God's kingdom presence and power are breaking into our world today, and a whole new creation has begun. And so right at the start here of our session tonight, NT Wright is challenging that, oh gosh, are we hung up? That way of thinking. Looks like my camera might have hung up on me. So hold on. Let me just try this. You might still be able to hear me, but it looks like my camera might have hung up. So hold on, everybody. Hold on. Stay where you are. Have a little technical difficulty. Technical difficulty with the camera. Yeah. Hold on. If you can hear me, let me know that. You can still hear me? Okay. All right. Well, I'll tell you what we're going to do. We're going to try going to the video, and that might kind of free me up here. So let me do that, and then we'll come back and I'll see if I can get my camera fixed. Okay. So let's go to the video, and we'll come back and catch up with our conversation after that. Hang on.
One of the fascinating things about Escombe Church here is that it's much closer in date to the time of Jesus himself than it is to our day. It was built within 700 years of the time of Jesus, and we are now 1400 more years out beyond that. But it isn't just that. We're surrounded here by old tombstones from several different periods, and a lot of them have got inscriptions which actually tell you what people believed about life after death and what hope there might be. So there's one inscription here which has a nice little poem which actually expresses the classic Christian hope. It says, "Go home, dear friends, and leave us here, and let us lay till Christ appear. When Christ appears, we hope to have a joyful rising from the grave." Now that is the mainstream Christian hope. We're resting here at the moment. This isn't the end of the story. Jesus is going to return, and when he returns, there will be a resurrection. All these graves, like in all English churchyards, they're all facing east, so that it was assumed that Jesus would rise like the sun in the east, and then they would all stand up to greet him when he arrived. That is the classic Christian hope. But for many, for the last 150 years or so, the hope has been transformed into something quite different. It's just about, for many people now, going to heaven when you die. No mention of resting and then something else, no mention of a bodily resurrection, just an abandoning of this world and a flying off somewhere else. And indeed, in this very churchyard, there are some of the graves which tell it like that. So many people are confused about this that it's really important we study it carefully. And that's what this session is going to be all about. So what exactly happened to Jesus 3 days after he was executed? Why did the early Christians use that strange word resurrection when they wanted to say what they thought had happened? And what can we say about our view of what they were thinking? To answer those quite interesting questions, I found it helpful to go back and track a bit through what people in the first century believed about what happened to people after they died. You can divide those views broadly into two, ancient pagan views and ancient Jewish views. The ancient pagans had a whole range of things they believed. After all, some of the Roman emperors believed that when they died, they were going to become gods and their female family goddesses. But there were many other views as well. Some ancient pagans just believed that when you died, that was it, that was the end. You find on some ancient tombstones a little Latin tag which basically means, once upon a time I wasn't, once I was, now I'm not, and I don't care. That was quite a common view in those days. But there were others who took a more cheerful view that your body would die and decay, but that your soul would go somewhere really nice and pleasant and live there for a long time. Or others of them believed that your soul would rest a while and then would come back into a different body. You would turn into somebody else, and so on and so on. There are lots of variations on those beliefs. The Jewish people had less variety, but still some. Some of them seem to have believed that death really was the end. Some of them seem to have believed that the soul would go off somewhere else. But interestingly, leading up to the period of the time of Jesus, a significant number of Jewish people really did believe that one day, not instantly, but that one day, God would raise from the dead all his people, perhaps even the whole human race, but certainly all his people or all his righteous people. And when they used that resurrection idea, they didn't mean a soul going off into the blue yonder. They meant somebody being raised from the dead physically so that they were really themselves again, perhaps even more so. So we have to ask the question, not only why did the early Christians say that that's what happened to Jesus, but interestingly, what did they think would happen to them and to all people sooner or later? This is particularly striking because across many cultures, including contemporary cultures, the things that people believe about life after death, the things they say about that, somebody's funeral, for instance, tend to be very conservative. You tend to say pretty much what people said to you when you were young, because it's a time, a very solemn time, for sticking with what you know and where the tradition has left you. But fascinatingly, all the early Christians for whom we have evidence right across the first 100 and 200 years of Christianity, they all said that what was going to happen was resurrection. In other words, they went for one option and only one option out of that whole range of ancient pagan and Jewish worldviews. So it's a question that the historian has to ask. Why did they all change their mind, go for this one? They had other options. Why did they plump for this and only this? Of course, their answer was, the reason we're going this route is that Jesus of Nazareth was raised from the dead. So we have to go back and look at the stories they told about what had happened. And when we go back to the books we call the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we find that each of them tells the story of the first Easter day in some significantly different ways. And that's fascinating because, if they'd got together 40 or 50 years later and said, it's time we actually wrote up a story that'll convince people, they wouldn't have done it like that. They'd have cobbled it together and made sure that all the details matched exactly. But the stories don't look like that. They look more like what you'd could get if there was an extraordinary event, a road accident or a plane crash or something, and everyone in the breathless hours after that happened telling it like they'd seen it, often with bits and pieces of details upside down and inside out. That's a bit how the Gospels read at that point. But there are other odd things about those stories which make me as a historian think that they really have the ring of this is how they told it at the beginning. For instance, very interestingly, the women, Jesus' followers who were women, play a very significant and striking role in all of them. The men are away hiding somewhere. Jesus' male followers thought that the authorities were going to come after them as well. But the women were the first at the tomb, and they were the first to go and tell people. Now, feminists among us may think, well, isn't that great? Fine, and pass on. But it's more interesting than that, because in the first century world, women were not regarded as credible witnesses. In other words, again, if you were making up these stories 5 weeks or 50 years later, you would never have invented women as your primary witnesses. But there they are, front and center in the stories. Something very strange is going on here. In addition, the portrait of Jesus in those resurrection stories is fascinating, because in some of the Jewish speculations about resurrection, they seem to be saying that people will come back exactly as they were before, no change, back into the same body, the same sort of physical life, and you'll just have it all over again. Whereas others among the people who speculate about resurrection seem to be saying that when we're raised, we'll be like stars in the heaven, we'll be shining like heavenly bodies. Interestingly, in the stories in the Gospels, neither of those is true. Obviously, Jesus is not shining like a star. They would have said that if that had been how it was. He appears to begin with as somebody just like them, and he eats and he drinks with them, and he can be touched. But then there are very strange things that happen as well, because sometimes he appears and disappears, and sometimes they don't know quite what's going on. Is he really there? They thought he was a ghost, and then it turns out he isn't after all. And again, I have to say, if they'd been making up stories later in order to say, there you are, he's really physical after all, they wouldn't have done it like this. One of the leading scholars of our day, who is not himself actually a practicing Christian, has put it like this: it looks as if they were trying to say something for which they knew they didn't have very good language. In other words, something new is going on here. What was it, this new thing? Well, we can track back historically and say that the only way that they would have told stories like that was if two particular things had happened. On the one hand, there must really have been an empty tomb which they knew was Jesus' tomb. And on the other hand, there must have been meetings with someone, sightings of someone who they took to be Jesus himself. If you didn't have the first, they would have said that those sightings were just hallucinations. They knew as much about hallucinations as we do. If you didn't have the second, they would have said, oh, well, the tomb has been robbed. Tomb robbery was quite common in the ancient world, particularly of well-known people, because robbers would hope that there might be jewels or other valuable goods in the grave with them. It really does look as though the tomb was empty and there were real meetings with Jesus. And you can go through all the options, all the skeptical accounts of, oh, well, it must have been like this or that or the other. But actually, I and many others have done that. And the answer is nope, they don't work. They don't explain the rise of the early Christian faith. The only way to explain it is to say that Jesus hadn't just been resuscitated back into the same life. He had done something quite new. He had gone, as it were, through death and out the other side with a new sort of body, of which there had been no previous example, and of which to this day there remains no subsequent instance. Now the skeptic will say, well, that's utterly ridiculous, and the early Christians knew then that it was indeed ridiculous, and many people said that. But actually they discovered that what they said about their experience of meeting Jesus and knowing him to be alive somehow began to change everything. And they discovered that resurrection wasn't just something that happened to Jesus. Resurrection meant that God's new creation had begun. The new world had already started, not with a great bang and suddenly everything being transformed overnight, but with this one prototypical event which was going to generate and drive a whole new world. And you can see that they believed that in the way that they tell the stories. In John's Gospel, in chapter 20, when he is describing what happened on that very first Easter day, he reminds us that it was the first day of the week. And a little bit later in the chapter, he says it's the first day of the week. And you might think, well, what's so special about that? And the answer is John has written his gospel very carefully, in such a way as to remind us of the great sequence in the book of Genesis, the great sequence of creation. And he's now saying, this is a new creation. This is the first day of the new week. Because the point that he's making, as they all do, is that the story doesn't go like this. Jesus died, Jesus was raised, therefore that's all right, we get to go to heaven. No, resurrection is about a new bodily life in this world and for this world. What they are saying is that the resurrection of Jesus means that God's new creation has begun, and therefore we have a job to do. Our calling then in the light of Easter is to be, as it were, advance foretastes of that new creation. That is to say, we are to be in ourselves both the beneficiaries of it and the agents of it. What exactly does that mean? It means, to begin with, that the power which was launched at Easter was like a great explosion of God's new power in the whole world. That power is to transform our lives. That's what happens when somebody discovers that the message of Jesus seems to be bubbling up inside them and making them think and feel and behave differently. But it's never just something for ourselves. Jesus spoke earlier in John's Gospel about the living water which he would give, but he didn't just say, I'll give you the living water for you. He says that you are to be somebody out of whom that living water will flow. And for somebody living in the Middle East then or now, living water is pretty important. If you're in the desert, you need that water. You need fresh water to drink, to be refreshed, to stop from starving and getting totally overheated. Our lives are to be like that. God's intention is to flood the dry and dusty creation with his new life, and we are to be people through whom that happens. And that can be through the gifts that God has given us of maybe creativity, of artistic work, through the passion that God gives us to make justice happen in his world. It can be through the tenderness and kindness that we find bubbling up within ourselves to go and look after people who badly need it. And so often in our world, there are plenty of people very close at hand who come into that category. One way or another, we are to be, as I said, not only the beneficiaries for ourselves of that new creation, we are to be people through whom it happens out there in God's world.
Okay. Well, you can hear me, but you can't see me. So let me see if I can fix that, and then we'll pick up our discussion. So just kind of hold where you are, and give me a moment. There I am. I should be back. Okay. So just having some technical issues on my side of things tonight, so appreciate your patience. And wanted to actually have you start thinking with me. First of all, NT Wright really puts out there some wonderful thinking, at least things that can challenge our thinking and bring to our minds ways in which we can be challenged to grow and deepen our understanding of the power of the resurrection. And so it's good that we have some opportunity to discuss that. The first thing, though, I'd like to talk about, kind of pull it back a bit to say that let's acknowledge the fact that there is some challenge to our minds in trying to make sense of the resurrection. And that's my first question. I'm going to write it down just so I can put it out here for us to hold on to. What is the problem with a concept like resurrection at the heart of your faith? Now, that may seem like a strange question, but I think it's a fair question. What are some of the inherent issues that in some ways are obvious when you have something like the resurrection at the key and center place. Katya says we've never seen it before, and we've not experienced it personally either. So we don't have something we can look to or point to or document that says, there it is. So that's an issue, that we didn't experience it. We haven't experienced it. Yeah. So other things that come to your mind and thought about what makes this challenging. Appreciate Katya getting us started with that. Liz says no one's ever seen it. You don't even know what to picture in order to believe it. So if we're hanging our faith on what we can see, touch, and feel, then what do we do when we're talking about resurrection? Drew says that we don't have any concrete proof to give us the confidence or validation in our belief. So again, where do we point to say there it is, and there is no doubt about it because everyone can acknowledge what's happening here. There's just not that body of proof, and no pun intended by picking the word body there. I'm just saying resurrection almost defies our capacity to try to prove it. And if I was going to make any critique of NT Wright, I would just say he spends a lot of time, at least in the first part of his book, going back as a historian to say, here are the issues and problems with it historically. It's fair enough to focus on all of that, but ultimately it comes down to a position of faith. Chuck says the problem can be the fact that the Bible doesn't really fully define the concept. We can only assume that Jesus provides the model. So it's something that Jesus embodies and is wrapped around his reality. And yet, you're right, Chuck, the Bible, if we go to it for the facts of it, leaves us wanting because they're just not there. There's not that clear evidence and the kinds of things that we often look to prove a point. Kathy says it's not supported by science. Yeah, Thomas is the early us. Oh, doubting Thomas, Lee is saying. So we have kind of a nature of doubt, like prove it to me, right? I'll believe it when I see it kind of thing. The fact of it, back to Kathy's point there too, is that, we know what happens to bodies after they die. We can see that. Scientifically, we understand that. We get the breakdown of molecules and the disintegration of, physicalness that then is reduced to the basic elements of our created world. So there's plenty of evidence what happens to us if we think of us as being this body after we die. And I think that presents some challenges to those of us who are Christian and have at the heart and soul of our faith resurrection. Brenna says resurrection had never happened before Jesus. It has never happened since. So if it's this isolated Jesus event, then what does that mean for us, and how do we get a hold of that? And what is the significance? Sam says it's not a problem to believe Jesus was resurrected, but perhaps it is when thinking of everyone else in the future. So when we think of what happens to us, or when it happens to other people, or when it happens to all of those since Jesus until now, what is this resurrection all about? So I just wanted to take a moment just to, in a sense, acknowledge the elephant in the room, if you will, or at least to in an honest way say, this is part of it. The struggle of trying to wrap our minds around it, trying to rationalize it, trying to have it make sense. And often in our experience of faith, when that becomes the primary focus, how to make sense of it, how to take what is a mystery and make it not mysterious anymore, then we're often on kind of sandy ground. It's not real solid. So I just wanted to acknowledge that that's part of what we're doing. Now, NT Wright in his video there gave us some description of the different kinds of ways that folks, even in Jesus' time, thought about resurrection. Of course, there were the pagan views, and there were the Jewish views, And there were multiple other views too. The point is, I think, that the idea, the concept, the thinking around resurrection was not brand new. It was out there. It was a part of culture. In some ways, I think human beings from the very beginning of us have wondered and thought about, those big questions. Why am I here? What am I supposed to be about while I'm here? Where am I going when I'm not here anymore? So, those have always been a part of the human experience, and they certainly were in and around the culture of Jesus' time. So the idea of resurrection wasn't brand new, but what NT helps us see is that the ways the early followers of Jesus, what we now know to be the early Christian church, the way those first believers responded to what happened, what they called the resurrection of Jesus, it was new. Sort of to Brenna's point there, this wasn't what it had been understood to be. This wasn't some general resurrection of everyone. This wasn't, some, in a pagan view, some immortal spark that goes to be with God, even though there's a lot of that thinking even yet today. This was something different. This was a man they knew, Jesus, who was killed, crucified on a cross, buried, dead, Jesus, and then their encounter of the one they came to experience as that Jesus. So it was something new and different. And part of what NT is saying is historically we have to understand that, or at least leave space for that to be true, because it gave birth to a whole community of people. And it couldn't be something that was just fabricated somehow and manipulated. That would not have presented the world with this brand new expression of community and faith that we know of as the Christian church. So to that point, let me ask, all of the Gospels, of course, give us a witness of the resurrection, and yet each one of the Gospels does it differently, has a different perspective. I want to ask, what about that? The fact that all four Gospels have a different perspective on it actually strengthens our assurance in the event of what we call the resurrection. What about the fact that four Gospels present it somewhat differently and from different angles of perspective can actually strengthen our embrace of the reality of it? Any thought about that? I know that's even as I'm saying that question, it sounds like kind of a hard question, maybe not even a very clear question. So I'll pause and see if anybody's got an idea about that. If that's not working, I can come at it differently, or try to anyway. I'm just trying to think of what's valuable for us, the fact that we've got the four different witnesses from the four different Gospels. None of them tell it exactly the same. None of them have exactly the same perspective or focus or a priority of kind of emphasis. So I'm trying to think, what's valuable in that for us. There's got to be something there that can be helpful. Let's see what you're coming up with. And that says everyone sees the same event from their own point of view. It would be rare to have the exact eyewitness accounts. So actually, the fact that they have different accounts is a verification of the reality of it. Because if it was fabricated, they all say it the same way. Here's the story. This is what you're supposed to say. No, it's a witness to the event. And so in that respect, it comes out in those unique perspectives. As Annette's saying, Drew says different accounts provide different perspectives. I think that's what we're saying there. Special meanings from those different points of view. So we can learn and be inspired and encouraged from all sides of this, I think is partly what I hear Drew saying. Liz says, like the author stated, it's the actual event, everyone experiences it differently. If it were false, again, they would have sat down, told each other, okay, let's get this straight. In case anybody asks, this is what we're going to say. No, it didn't come out that way. Good analogy of witnesses to a car accident, Lee says. Yeah, We know what that's like. We know how that happens as human beings. Karen says, since there's more than one account, the resurrection makes it more likely to have happened. Yeah, there we go. So we're getting it. I guess maybe the question wasn't such a bad question after all, because your responses are fantastic. I'm impressed with you. Matt says, makes collusion or a manufactured story less likely. Exactly. And that certainly has been part of the critique of Christianity over time. Sam says, similar to eyewitnesses, someone experiences something different from that lens or perspective, so that makes, again, sense. And Dave says, NT Wright says, at the beginning of a new creation, life seems a little different in biblical times. So just the way that they thought about, experienced, and shared life had a different feeling to it, different character to it than what we know. And Brenda says, yes, to everything that we're saying, I'm sure. Because the disciples didn't say to each other, how we're going to explain this. Let's get our story straight. No, they experienced it firsthand. So this is testimony is a better word perhaps, testimony of what was experienced, the encounters that they had with a presence that for them was Jesus. And, here we are because of that witness and because of that power. One other thing on this point, and then we'll move off of it. The women, NT Wright mentioned the fact, and I don't know if you realize that, but if you look at all the Gospels, even though the actual details are not identical, and we've just talked that through, what is similar is that women are the first to witness the tomb being empty and actually become the first to make witness that he is risen. And N.T. Wright has us think about, what's important about that. So before we jump off of it, just to clarify, and if anybody's got a way to put that out there for us to think about, I invite you to do that. What is it about the women, particularly being those first and early witnesses to the reality of both empty tomb and a resurrected Jesus that becomes very significant for us to affirm that? You got a thought about that? Maybe it's obvious, although I don't know that it is. I think the point that N.T. Wright makes, and others have made it too, that I think feels significant before we jump off of it here tonight, is the fact that in that day, women were regarded as not valuable for anything that was significant or important. They were thought of as property in some cases. They were often treated that way, and they were used to accompany and to, direct. Let me make sure don't have a problem with my feed here. It looks like I'm still okay. All right. What happened with women was that they were not credible, was the thought. And so again, if women then become the primary witness to what's happening, then that is in itself an indication that this certainly wasn't something that was fabricated or some grandiose plan to try to convince the world. Because if that was the case, then the case would have been made much stronger and much more firmly, that being connected to a male person or multiple male persons. So another just historical fact that helps to kind of lift up, buoy, strengthen our witness that something happened. Tim says, kudos to the men who kind of stuck their neck out to say lowly women made the discovery. Yeah, I mean, they told it like it was, and even though that wasn't the smart thing to do. And I think N.T. Wright helps us understand. So let's move on here in this last segment of our time together tonight. N.T. Wright says that some folks think about resurrection like this, and I want to quote him. He says, some think it this way: Jesus died, Jesus was raised, and now we get to go to heaven. Did you hear that? Some folks think of it this way. Jesus died, Jesus was raised, and now we get to go to heaven. I want to catch Chuck as he responds, and Karen too. Women, remember the details. Yeah, got it. And Chuck says again, reported role of women at the time supports the truth of the accounts. Yeah. So I wanted to capture those comments before we move on. And then back to the statement at hand. NT Wright says, some folks think of our faith this way. Jesus died, Jesus was raised, and now we all get to heaven. And in case you haven't picked up yet, he really challenges that. In fact, he's got a problem with that. And I do want to say, in my own experience, and even in my own heart and life, sometimes it does get reduced to that. That the core of the Christian faith is exactly that. Jesus died, Jesus was raised, and now we get to be in heaven. And what NT Wright is pushing against is to say, folks, first of all, that's not really biblical. And secondly, that's certainly not what the early first followers of Jesus, and particularly those who encountered a resurrected Jesus, were focused on. That wasn't their message. That's not the message of Paul, the Apostle Paul, in the earliest writings of the church. Jesus died, Jesus was raised, and now we all get to go to heaven. No. Instead, it is this reality of how the fact that Jesus has been raised, then we are given life in a new way now. So there's this incredible creative power of God that is transforming everything, not just Jesus, but because of what God is doing in Jesus, we then too. I think that's why that phrase is one that I just resonate so strongly with at Easter time. Christ lives so that we can live also. It's not Christ lives or Christ is risen so that we can go to heaven someday. No, Christ lives, Christ is raised from the dead so that we can live also. In other words, so that something changes, is transformed, is created anew in us and now. And for me, I think that's one of the reasons in which it seems to me N.T. Wright talks a lot about, he did in the video, and if you've done any of the readings in his book, he talks a lot about the bodily nature of the resurrection. And not that it was necessarily the body that hung on the cross, but that Jesus is raised and is then encountered in a bodily way. And I think what he's saying is that's still the way resurrection power works. It works in bodily form, and it takes shape, and it impacts us, and it involves us, and it connects with us. And those are the kinds of things that I'm finding to be particularly valuable in this study that we're encountering and sharing together. I mentioned at the start tonight that I wanted to come back here in these last minutes together to that statement that I read at the beginning. Can I read that again for us? It goes like this. The hope of the resurrection is more than anticipating we will leave this world someday and go to heaven. Rather, it is a bold confidence that God's kingdom presence and God's kingdom power are breaking into our world today, and a whole new creation has begun. And so I just want to ask a question about that. What's the difference? What's possible? What becomes real when resurrection moves from a thought of, I'm going to get to heaven someday, to it creates in us and me this presence and power of God that is breaking loose now. What's possible when we make that shift from heaven, our eyes set on heaven, that sweet by and by someday, and a resurrection power at work here, now, in me, in you? Can we put any words to that? Can we identify some things that we think are possible, or things that change, or the ways in which our thinking, or the way in which we go about our life is in any way altered when that becomes true for us, that shift? I know you're thinking about that, and I appreciate that because I think it deserves some thought. So, I don't expect immediate responses, but if you do have some thoughts, of course, we always invite you to share those so that we can kind of be in that together. So here they come, and I appreciate it, and let's think and talk about it together. Matt says we fulfill our purpose as image bearers of God. So there's a calling involved here. It's to be who God creates us to be. Matt says it's that image of God that is part of our calling. Liz says it enables us to live for others. And instead of thinking I'm set and I can hang out and wait, in other words, I'm good to go, it keeps us open to what it is God is still doing and will do. So that's important. Brenda says Jesus died so that, she says, we, that's us, can become Easter people so that we can find new life through Christ. I've had those thoughts in my heart since last week, that we're an Easter people. It's a creation. God never has stopped this creative process, and Brenda's reminding us of that, and it's happening in us and through us. So yeah, that's a very contemporary, current, relevant, immediate kind of experience, and I like that. Karen says, we can live our best life in Christ here instead of waiting for that future time, that date, that place, whatever that is, that heaven place, right? Janine says in John 11 that he is the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in him will live. Yeah. And doesn't necessarily say we'll live in heaven, but live here, right? And perhaps the women were not afraid to show their faith and the men were hesitant, as sometimes is still the case, as we know. Kathy says there's hope for today and for tomorrow. So when resurrection power is at work here in us now, then disappointment or discouragement or what seems or feels to be a dead end, though that's real, it's not the end. And Kathy's saying that the hope is born beyond that because of this way in which resurrection lives. Carol, hopefully the confidence of the holy boldness to go forth to bear Christ's living water. So there's a confidence that comes in this that maybe wouldn't be there without it, probably would not be there without it. In other words, it makes it possible in us to be strong and confident. Lee says, in a broad sense, it enables free will to be centered on God. All right? So it can free us, this resurrected life, not to worry about trying to get somewhere someday. And so much of our Christian faith, I just want to be honest about it, seems to me to be focused so much of the time on I want to get to heaven someday, so I'm doing all of these things so that I can get there. And, actually this whole experience that is given to us in Christ is meant to set us free from that kind of legalistic way. And as Lee says, the freeing up is to truly be centered in God, but truly to be in a position where God flows through us. And Chuck says to find God's purpose in our lives and connect with God and to fulfill what God has intends for us, what he identifies here as a goal, God's goal for us. So it becomes a God-centered life. It becomes a God-purposed life, this resurrection power, and it's now. It's not so I can get somewhere someday, maybe if everything works out. That's a hope, but that's a thin hope. That's a hope that is fragile and can easily be broken or dried up and blow away. because anything I do that goes against whatever that is supposed to look like then puts all of that in jeopardy. And I live then both fearfully and uncertain. And everything that I do is an anxiousness, then an anxious worry to bring that back or to make that possible. And what NT Wright is saying is, hey, resurrection's now. It's heaven and earth coming together. That we, Chuck's referring back to Lee's comment, this resurrection, it turns our focus on God. It recenters everything. It reshapes everything. It recreates us, and that's the power of it. Well, friends, thank you for connecting, for being together, for responding, for your patience. Some crazy technical stuff tonight. Never know. It just, it's one of those things. But we got it. We held it together. We got it working, and so that's all that really matters. And here we are, and we're going to keep going forward. So next Wednesday, same thing. I'll send you all the links. Those of you viewing, we're glad that you're with us. Those of you seeing this as a recording, we're glad you're participating, and particularly those who are involved in our chat and our conversation, how valuable that is to us as we learn together. Mary says here at the end of our time that Jesus said the kingdom of heaven is at hand. It's here and now, and we choose whether or not to participate. So we do have choice in this, and that is part of the responsibility that's given to us, to recognize it, to be open to it, to respond to it. All right. Appreciate all the good words. Keep those going. I'll keep the chat up for a minute or so as we move to a conclusion. Hang in there. We're going to worship together this Sunday. Look for the link. We'll be sending that to you through the church communication. And it'll be good to join together and worship soon. But for now, take care. God bless.